Welcome to Bloodmoons and the Crown, a prophetic anthology of the end times. Each week, these fictional, biblically based short stories speak to what will happen before the war at Armageddon, where Jesus Christ will return to earth and eradicate Satan and sin from our world. Learn what the Bible has to say about end times prophecy through these emotionally charged accounts of what people could one day face.
Entry 3, late October, off Massachusetts. Lord, the first bowl has been poured out. I read it in Revelation and I watched it arrive in the world, and I want to write it down while it is still sharp. So the first went and poured out his bowl upon the earth, and a foul and loathsome sore came upon the men who had the mark of the beast, and those who worshipped his image. Revelation 16:2 NKJV. The radio had been reporting it for several days before I understood what I was hearing. They called it a spontaneous dermatological event, a systemic inflammatory response, a novel pathogen selectively targeting a specific protein variant in certain individuals. The explanations shifted daily because none of them held up. What the official voices could not say, what none of them said openly, was that the sores were appearing specifically on people who had received the mark. I know this because of what I observed from Providence's cockpit yesterday morning. A small motorboat came around a headland from the north, moving erratically, weaving in the kind of pattern that indicates a person at the wheel who is in considerable pain and is having difficulty concentrating. I watched it through the binoculars. A middle-aged man steering, heavy-set, and even at 200 yards I could see that something was wrong with his face and his exposed arms. The skin was darkened in irregular patches, raised and swollen in a way that ordinary illness does not produce. He was not steering straight. He came within 50 yards of Providence before he saw me and cut the throttle. He called across the water. "You got any medicine? Anything for the pain?" I told him I had a medical kit, but that I doubted it contained anything that would address what he was describing. "The sores," he said. His voice was thin. My God, the sores. He pushed back his sleeve and I did not need the binoculars anymore. From his wrist to above his elbow, the arm was covered in raised, dark lesions, not blisters in the ordinary sense, something that had begun beneath the skin's surface and was working outward through it. The edges of each lesion were the color of a deep bruise edging towards something darker. He was shaking. "When did you take the mark?" I asked him. He stared at me for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, 6 weeks ago. "How did you know?" All the animation had gone out of his voice when I asked it. I told him I had been reading the Bible, that what he was experiencing had been written down in advance and was the result of the mark he had taken. I told him gently, because this is not a thing you tell a suffering man with anger. He was a man who had made a choice without understanding its full and terrible weight, and the weight had arrived. I asked his name. He said Robert. I asked Robert if he would allow me to tell him about the God who had allowed this judgment and about what Robert might still do with whatever time remained to him. He looked at me for a long time across the gray water. Then he said, "Lady, I don't have time for this." And he put the boat in gear and drove it north. I watched him go. The boat moved away and grew small against the Massachusetts coast and disappeared behind the headland. Then I sat down in the cockpit and I prayed for Robert for about 10 minutes, which is longer than I have prayed for anything since I got on my knees that night in October. I asked you to find a way to reach him. I asked you to send someone into his path before the end of whatever time he has left. I asked you to be merciful with a man who made a choice he did not understand, though I know the warnings were available to anyone willing to read them. The sores on Robert's arms are on millions of people now. The radio is full of it. The government calling it an epidemic. Physicians on broadcast describing a lesion pattern they have never seen. Pharmaceutical companies offering experimental treatments. None of it is working. Nothing men make will treat the judgment of God. And the people at the mark checkpoints are displaying symptoms that their own agents cannot ignore. And the system is beginning to fracture at its edges as the bearers of the mark discover that the mark has not protected them from anything. I have not taken the mark. I will not take the mark. Providence and the sea and the abandoned summer homes along this coast are my supply chain, and it is a thin one. But it is enough, and it is mine, without costing me what the mark would cost. Today I caught 2 mackerel on a hand line. I cooked them in olive oil I found in a summer house near the Maine border, with crackers and a tin of vegetables. I ate in the cockpit watching the sun go down behind the Massachusetts hills, and for about 20 minutes the world was bearable. You are in the bearable moments too, aren't you? Not just in the dramatic ones. I'm beginning to understand that. Carol. Entry 4. November. Off the New Jersey coast. Lord. The mark system is fully operational now along the entire East Coast. I tested this yesterday, and I want to record what I saw because it clarified things for me in ways the radio had not. I had come ashore at a small town in New Jersey, the kind of town that was mostly a collection of gas stations and diners when it was a going concern and is now largely empty, except for a distribution point the new government has established at the old gas station on the main road. I tied the dinghy to a dock post and walked up the road toward town to see how things stood. I stayed on the far side of the street in the shadow of a closed pharmacy, and I watched the distribution point for about an hour. There was a line of perhaps 40 people behind a rope barrier. At the front of the line, 2 uniformed agents with handheld scanning devices and a folding table stacked with boxes of food and supplies. Each person who reached the front raised their right hand and held it under the scanner. The agent either nodded and directed them to the supply table or shook his head and gestured them away from the line. The ones turned away did not argue. They left with the faces of people who have exhausted their energy for argument. I watched a woman try to make a case. She had her daughter with her, a girl of 18 or 19. And she held the girl's hand and she spoke to the agent with increasing urgency while he listened with the flat patience of someone who has been given exactly one instruction and no discretion. He pointed away from the line. The woman bent down and spoke to the girl. The girl looked up at the agent, then at her mother, then nodded. They walked away together, the woman's hand holding the girl's, and they did not look back. I walked back to the dinghy and rowed back to Providence and sat in the cockpit for a long time. Lord, here is what I have come to understand about food. The world is full of it if a person is willing to look in the right places and accept the reality that ownership has become a flexible concept in a world where 40% of property owners have vanished. The summer homes along the coast have not been exhausted. They were stocked for summer seasons that never happened and then locked and abandoned, and many of them contain pantries that represent months of supply for a single woman on a sailboat. I have become practiced at reading the backs of houses from the dinghy, at identifying which ones are likely to have what I need, at entering and taking what I require and leaving the rest. 4 days ago, I found what I have been thinking of as the pantry of God's grace. A large house set well back from the beach in New Jersey, owned by someone who clearly believed in preparedness. The pantry held 60 pounds of rice and dried beans in sealed containers, 4 large tins of olive oil, dried pasta, multiple cases of canned vegetables, and soup and tuna, coffee, real ground coffee, Lord, which I have been without for 6 weeks, and the absence of which has been more acutely felt than I expected. And in a locked cabinet in the garage, which yielded to Thomas Whitfield's fire poker after about 3 minutes, a full year's supply of freeze-dried backpacking meals. Someone had been preparing for something. I don't know if they were raptured or left behind somewhere without access to their preparations. I took what I needed, not all of it by deliberate choice, because there is a line I'm trying to hold between necessity and greed, and I am not always sure where that line is. And I left. I have been eating well for 4 days. Last night, I made a freeze-dried beef stew that, after 2 months of tuna and crackers, produced in me a gratitude so intense that I said thank you out loud to the empty cockpit of a sailboat anchored off the New Jersey coast, and meant it the way you mean something when every nerve in your body is participating in the meaning. I am in John now, the Gospel of John. The Jesus in these pages is not the vague cultural figure I carried around for 6 decades. He is specific and particular and direct. He says things that arrest me mid-paragraph and will not let me continue until I have sat with them. This morning I sat with John 3:16 for 20 minutes. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. John 3:16 key, the world. Not the world as it was before September, not the world as it will be when all of this is finished. This world, the broken, sore-covered, frightened, angry world that is currently standing in line at marked checkpoints and driving motorboats in pain and sleeping in the locked boats of abandoned marinas. God loved that world enough to give his son for it. He loved me enough for that. I am sitting with the weight of that. Still sitting. Carol. Entry 5. Late November into December, Chesapeake Bay Country. Lord, I met people today. Good ones. I want to write it down before the warmth of it fades. I was anchored in a small tributary creek off the Chesapeake Bay, one of hundreds of such creeks, most of them quiet now, most of the docks along them holding boats whose owners will not be returning. I was working on the Genoa furling mechanism, which had been stiff and reluctant for 2 weeks, when I heard a motor and looked up to see a mid-sized motorboat coming up the creek toward me. I went below and retrieved the flare gun and came back up to watch. 3 of them on the boat, a man steering, a woman standing in the bow with her hands visible, a teenage boy in the stern with his hands open at his sides. The man cut the engine at about 50 yards and called across the water. "Peace," he said. "We're just passing through. We saw you working and wondered if you might need any help." He was a large man, broad in the shoulders, with dark hair gone grey at the temples and the direct, steady eyes of someone who was not accustomed to posturing and did not intend to begin. The woman in the bow was watching me with the same careful assessment I was performing on them. The boy's open hands told me something about who his parents were. I put the flare gun down within reach and told them they could come alongside. His name was Dan Kowalski. His wife was Ruth. Their son was Eli. They had been on the water since October, when the mark system made life in their Pennsylvania town impossible for a family that had decided not to take it. Dan had been a building contractor. Ruth had been a high school librarian. Eli, who was 18, was the one who had been the most serious believer of the 3 of them before September. And that was how they described it when we were sitting in Providence's cockpit 20 minutes later with mugs of my precious New Jersey coffee warming our hands. Eli came home from a church camp in August with a whole packet on the Rapture and the end times, Ruth said. Pre-tribulational, premillennial, all the things I'd always thought were a bit too dramatic to take literally. She paused. I put the packet in a drawer the 1st of September. She looked out at the creek. Then September came. Dan said, and we went back to the drawer. They were believers now, all 3, and recently enough that it still had the quality of something immediate about it, something not yet fully integrated into the shape of daily life, but burning with the intensity of a conviction that had been tested and held. Eli had worked through the camp materials with his parents, and what they understood from those materials matched exactly what I had been piecing together on my own from Revelation and the radio. The rapture had been the real thing, the tribulation had begun, and the man presenting himself to the world as its rescuer was not its rescuer. "You didn't take the mark," I said. It was not a question. "No," Dan said, in a tone that was not defiance, but something more settled than defiance. The tone of a man who has made a decision from the bedrock of who he is rather than from the pressure of any particular circumstance. We talked for 3 hours in the cold November cockpit, with the creek quiet around us and the bare trees on the bank reflecting in the water. Eli had a study Bible with margins dense with notes, more detailed and accessible than Thomas Whitfield's plain Bible, and he walked me through several passages in Revelation that I had struggled with. The structure of the seals and trumpets and bowls, the relationship between them, the timeline, as Eli's camp materials described it. He was 16 years old, and he knew more theology than I had assembled in a lifetime, and he delivered it without any trace of condescension, with the plain enthusiasm of someone who has found something that matters completely. Ruth produced a jar of honey from an abandoned farm they had passed, some dried apples, and a small round of hard cheese wrapped in wax. I gave them canned goods from the New Jersey pantry and 2 of the freeze-dried meals. It was the kind of exchange that left both parties convinced they had received the better of it, which I understand now is how generosity is supposed to work. Before they left, Dan asked if we could pray together. I said yes. He led it, simple and direct, thanking you for the meeting, asking for safety on both our passages, asking for wisdom for whatever came next. And then he asked for his 2 older sons. He had 2 adult boys who had remained behind after the rapture, both of them already marked. His voice was steady and controlled when he said it, but Ruth put her hand briefly over her mouth and then took it away again and sat straight. Lord, that prayer hit me without warning in a place I was not prepared to be hit. I sat with my eyes closed and listened to Dan ask for his sons, and I added Stephanie and Marcus to his prayer in my heart silently, without saying their names aloud, because I was not ready to say their names aloud to strangers yet. But I said them to you. I said them with everything I had. I hope the Kowalskis make it. I hope Eli keeps that Bible dry. I hope Dan's steadiness holds. I hope Ruth's grief, which she was carrying with the posture of someone who has decided absolutely that she will not be knocked down by it, eases enough to breathe around. Thank you for them, Lord. Carol.
Thank you for joining us today. We hope this episode has inspired and encouraged you as you draw closer to our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. If you have thoughts, questions, or comments, we'd love to hear from you. You reach us via email at rev11.15media@gmail.com. We hope you're enjoying the story and learning what the Bible reveals about end times prophecy and the final battle at Armageddon. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time. May God keep and protect you always.